So hello everybody, my name is Jen and you are very welcome back to Law Hero. This week's video is kind of inspired by a film I saw 2 Fridays ago called Top Gun Maverick or Maverick Top Gun, I'm not sure. It wouldn't have been a film I would have chosen for myself, but actually there was a 1980s film called Top Gun, and this was like Tom Cruise coming back to show everybody that he's still got it. And I went to this film with an open mind. I was like, okay, grand. Then I realized there was fighter jets in it, and then I got a little bit more interested because obviously, being the gal that I am, I have a big interest in strategy. War strategy is one of my favorites. I've also read a lot of books around strategy and winning because, to be quite honest, it baffles me that certain people win and others don't, and really it's just a mindset shift. And I want to impart some of those hacks on you today because we're all capable of winning. We're all capable of reaching our potential. It's just that most of us have blockers, and these are usually self-imposed from our belief system. And I'll talk about that another time, but today we are solely focused on winning within the confines that we have. And for me, this is timely because tomorrow I will do my second triathlon of the season at Triathlon, and I will try and win the sprint. So this is almost like a pep talk for myself as well as for all the law people that follow me, and just like all the non-law people that follow me. I think to delve into this kind of stuff is really fun. So just so you know, I'm going to base this information in this video off 2 authors. The first is Alistair Campbell, who wrote a book called Winners, which I was drawn to. And by the way, I don't mean it in, you know, like the pretentious sense, like, oh, if you're not first, you're last, that kind of a thing. It's just that I mean winning in the sense of you reach your potential and there's no excuses. Like, you know, for example, last weekend I came second in the Calcutta run. There's no excuses. I didn't win it. I wanted to win it. I didn't win it. I didn't win it because I was 2 minutes slower than the person in front of me. There's no emotion there. There's just logic. I was 2 minutes slower. And that's what I mean by winning. And I have the potential to run 2 minutes faster, but just last week, I couldn't do that. So I have to accept that I didn't win. And I think what's after happening is, even though we're in a very like meritocracy kind of a world where we don't really talk about the influence of fortune or luck, obviously, of course, I'm a strong believer in luck, but this is putting all luck variables to the side and focusing on our controllables, as they say in sport, controlling your controllables. And this comes very much from existentialism, and you know, we are our choices, so it's whatever is within our control. For example, last week at the Calcutta run, what was in my control was to run to my ability. I couldn't control the fact that there was someone faster than me and won the race. All I could control was myself. The other book, which is very relevant to our strategy and a winning strategy, is by a man called John Boyd, who is military strategist for the US, and he wrote the book called Certain to Win. So those are the 2 books we're going to be talking about today. So firstly, I read Winners by Alistair Campbell in December 2020. So it was when, like, during the pandemic, I read an awful lot of books, and I'm still just kind of catching up on all the notes I took. And that's where this is basically coming from, because I want Law Hero to also be a sort of a like psychological boot camp recheck for the mind. Sometimes I watch my own videos back, I'm like, oh my god, that was so insightful, and it gives me a bit of inspiration. They really are, like, there's a real amount of knowledge in there. The knowledge doesn't come from me, it comes from everything I've read, and I just try and distill it down to make it more plausible for you guys. So when you set your mind to something, there has to be a plan. And so I'm talking about Alistair Campbell's Winners now. There has to be a plan. If you don't have a strategy to reach your goal, you're never going to reach it. Some people take this to the opposite extreme and they plan their goal to oblivion, but they never actually execute it or act on it. And there's a famous quote by Anna Wintour, who's the editor of Vogue who says that ideas are a dime a dozen, and it's true. And in that, and this is another phrase, it's like an American kind of from, I think it's from Texas, where they say nobody wants to die, but everybody wants to go to heaven. And it's true. We all want to take the shortcut, and I'm totally like, in my goals, I've tried to take the shortcut and it hasn't worked out. I haven't achieved a lot of my goals, and like the whole thing is a journey. You're constantly evolving as a human. Like, you go from your 20s to your 30s, you learn things, you learn through making mistakes, and you realize that, okay, yeah, my strategy there probably wasn't the best. So it's kind of being self-aware and like pivoting when something doesn't go right, and that is the whole point of strategy. Obviously, when you're trying to achieve a goal, you set the goal and then you work backwards. So for example, if my goal is to make sure I get up every day at 6 a.m, I set the clock, I make sure that there's an incentive to get out of bed. For me, it's coffee, or, you know, like, so that'll get my dopamine going so that it makes it easier to get out of the bed. I do things like lay out my clothes, and what I do as well is like put up the blind and open the window straight away so that I make the room cold, because if the room is cold, I won't hop back into the bed. Little things like that. It's like what you're doing is you're preempting your own weaknesses, and that is like the number one area around strategy. Is you know your strengths, whatever, you're good at those, but it's like your weaknesses. What are your weaknesses? My weaknesses, I'm a creature of comfort. I would love to get back into that bed, but like, I know if the room is cold, I won't. And that's why I call my dog Socrates, because my true belief is that in life, you're not battling external forces, you're battling your own weaknesses, you're battling yourself. And that's why I call my dog Socrates, because he said, like, to thine own self be true. And that basically means you cannot live this life to its fullest extent if you don't know yourself. Yeah. And this is moving a little bit away from you and your plan, is to never underestimate your opponent. They are working as hard as you are. So when it comes to self goals and self achievement, your opponent is your ego, and all the kind of destructive parts of you that are working against you, your negative beliefs, your negative mindset. That is the opponent within you. And Ryan Holiday has a fantastic book on how to beat your ego called Ego is the Enemy. It's based on Stoic philosophy around how to overcome your ego. But when it comes to like battling others, in the sense of war, like tomorrow I will battle others. The one rule which I think is very clear from Alistair Campbell's book is that to never underestimate your opponents. They are working as hard as you are. Now, for example, I train with my competitors in triathlon, and this is certainly true. They certainly train harder than I do. But you know, we all have to have a certain amount of empathy for ourselves. We can't be thinking, oh, you know, I'm so bad compared to other people. Confidence is something you cannot put a price on, and it is something that comes from within. And you will notice a lot of the time that confidence actually comes before action. So a lot of the time you actually have to talk yourself into being the baddest you can be, and actually the action will follow. So mood follows action. So he says you have to be brutal in pointing out your own weaknesses. As much as you need to know your opponent, don't be defined about how they play. Make sure you check the results that comes from your strategy and be adaptable. Strategies have to be repeated endlessly. And he gives the example of Alex Ferguson sacking Roy Keane, because he said that no one is bigger than the team, not even the captain. This was a short-term sacrifice, but a long-term investment in the value of the club. An important part of strategy is rejecting goals which are contradictory. Okay, so based on what we have just said there, in that you have to be brutal in pointing out your own weaknesses, I would literally sit down with, so whatever goal you have, put it at the very top here, and then write down, okay, strengths and weaknesses, kind of like SWOT analysis, but you're not really doing the opportunities and threats because we're only looking at strengths and weaknesses here. And be brutal about your weaknesses. And like, for example, if your goal is to lose weight, you're like, okay, I'm going to be brutally honest. Before I go to bed, I love to go to the fridge And the reason is because it just makes me feel good. And you have to be really honest with yourself and be like, why is that a weakness? Because I will have whatever, tended to my diet for the whole day or tended to my healthy eating for the whole day, and I will mess it all up in 5 minutes. So if you want to be brutal about that, just don't buy the food, for example. Or because if you know yourself, the best thing to do is just not have the food in the house. I've had this issue myself. The point around Roy Keane sacking the captain, I think is very interesting. And I would actually equate that to just not buying the food. So for example, if people come over to your house, like, which this has happened to me many, many times, and they're like, why don't you have dairy? Why don't you have sugar? Why don't you have like crisps here? Why don't you have chocolate here? I'm like, oh, because I don't eat that stuff. And so you sacrifice basically a little bit like your sociability, and people may not want to come to your house as much because they don't like the way you eat, but it's like in honor of your long-term commitment to yourself, to your future self. Or for example, like I was saying the other day to my beauty therapist, she was telling me she finds it very difficult to say no to her friends on a Saturday night. And she did my lashes, by the way. I did not do these myself. She was telling me she finds it very difficult to say no to her friends when they want to go out of a Saturday night, and she says that just always ends up binge drinking. And then on Sunday she's really guilty because she doesn't do her sport. She realizes she spent a lot of money and she's not moving towards her goals, she's moving away from them. So I said to her, okay, like, what's the sacrifice you can make? And like, how do you know yourself and your weaknesses? So like the positive thing she said about going out was getting dressed up and that like buzz of taking pictures and whatnot. And I was like, you need to, like, that routine of getting dressed up and like, you know, being the baddie on Instagram and like all your pictures, whatever. I was like, you can do that without having 9 drinks afterwards. Like, why don't you do that routine and make the reward, like this is the Q routine reward from Charles Duhigg. And the Q is like, you want the dopamine payout from the pictures and the getting dressed up. And then the reward is like looking good, having the pictures. So the routine in the middle of drinking, why don't you swap that out for going for a meal and be like, everybody's like 2 drinks and then you go home, and then the next day you're not hungover and you can go to the gym. I had that conversation with her, and she was like, you know, I'm just going to stop drinking. And I'm just like, no, like that doesn't work, because the brain's like, no, you're not. Like the brain, the psyche is always listening, and the brain like is not going to believe you. You're like, okay, like for me, for example, for shopping, like I'm like, never shopping again. And my brain's like, no, you're not. Come on, like stop lying. The more realistic thing to do would be to swap out the routine of shopping for something healthier, or reduce it, because that's like more palatable for your brain. So yeah, I need to sack Roy Keane in order to not be a shopaholic. Don't overbrain things to the point of inaction. Yeah, like that is another really good point, in that most people, they have overanalysis paralysis when they go for when they're going for a dream, in that they plan it to oblivion, but because they're so long planning, they're after getting the dopamine payout already, and so they don't act because they've already gotten a psychological payout, and that's enough for them. And then they have like the fear of failure, so they'd rather not do anything than risk themselves for the reward. The other thing when it comes to goal setting is realizing that we are irrational beings. Like people are like, oh, human beings are rational. No, we're not. Daniel Kahneman has proved that we are irrational, emotional beings, and that is detrimental when it comes to our goals. So Daniel Kahneman has taught us that when humans have an opinion, our natural thought process is to convince ourselves of it of 100% certainty, even though we're not sure where the opinion came from, because of that cognitive dissonance, in that we don't want to be wrong. We would rather be wrong and consistent than right and risk ourselves. And now that I've told you that, and if you look around at the people around you, even at your own decision making, you will see people who are stuck in cycles. They know the right thing to do, but they're comfortable with that pattern. And that's what keeps human beings stuck, is that certainty. they do what is familiar. You fall in love with people who are familiar to your trauma. You stay in cycles that are destructive, but they're familiar because you've seen them in another light as a child, or you've experienced them as trauma initially, but now it has become a vicious cycle and it's a payout. Like I always ask, and this is what I always say to people who are trying to get out of certain circumstances, I'm like, what are you getting out of it? And sometimes they don't understand, but there's always an emotional payout to your behavior. People will stay in bad relationships. People will not work towards their goals because they're getting some psychological payout. Sometimes it's playing the victim. Sometimes people don't get out of their circumstances because they're being left off the hook, for example. By playing the victim, people will go, oh, your parents died, so that's why you're a drug addict. It's easy. It's an easy thing to justify, but just be wary of that need for certainty. Okay, now we're going to move on to like a more kind of business strategy, and this really helps as well in sport. So this comes from John Boyd, who was one of the brains behind Operation Desert Storm, and he was like a strategist, a fighter pilot strategist, and this really ties into the Maverick film. So like one of the really nice phrases I like from that film is "don't think, just do." And it is very true, and just as I have alluded to from Winners by Alistair Campbell, there is a certain human tendency to overthink into oblivion, which causes inaction. So that's why it's better sometimes to turn off the brain. And so one of the interesting things is that one of the concepts that Boyd came up with was called the OODA loop. So this basically occurs when you need to make a decision quickly, and the acronym stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. So in any given scenario, when you're faced with a challenge, you observe, you orient yourself around the circumstances, you decide what you're going to do, and then you execute. And it's been used in business to try and empower people to make decisions when they're faced with crisis in the workplace. So for example, I've seen it used when it comes to like data breaches or security incidences. It's basically like information gathering, making a decision and then acting on it, so you see the decision through to the end, that it's not, the decision isn't getting stuck at, we'll say like, lower management, middle management, or upper management. It's like there's a constant push towards decisiveness, because a lot of people feel in big organizations, and indeed if you look back through financial crisis, that they're not responsible. So it's a way to empower people to take decisions. So you might ask yourself, how does this tie into me watching Top Gun? Well, if you watch the movie, or if you're planning on watching it, you will have noticed a few themes and concepts that run through the movie, and if you're familiar with Boyd's work, you will have noticed them in the movie. So the first one is maneuver warfare, which is a strategy used in the military that emphasizes disrupting the enemy's decision-making skills to defeat them. It revolves around the idea of surprise and deception. So if you watch Top Gun, you'll see that when Maverick is training the young fighter pilots, he will like come up behind them and they won't have noticed, because what he's trying to do is upset the balance with the aspect of surprise. It's like kind of guerrilla warfare. And the whole thing is like when he pops up behind you, that okay, you go ODA. So he's behind me. I'm orienting to the fact that he's behind me, I'm making a decision, I'm acting upon it. Mental models then is the representation or explanation of human behavior that exists on a personal internal level. A person can generate a mental model to understand their thought processes, decisions, and consequences. And this is part of the orientation of the OODA loop. So basically, orientation means that you are in this situation and your perception, the lens in which you see the world, is influenced by what you've experienced your entire life, the type of people you've been hanging around with, the whole nature-nurture thing. And some people have healthy mental models, other people have destructive mental models. What military strategy tells us that with enough training, you can change the neurological pathways, because they've been shown to be elastic, to make you think differently. And this is how you build habits, and this is how you change your mindset. So for example, if you really want to become a more positive person, somebody with tremendous discipline will try and change their mental model around thinking negatively by every time they have a negative thought, try and counter it with a positive one until it becomes a habit, and then habits become your character, and over time then that just becomes who you are. You become a more positive person, but it takes a lot of repetition. Situational awareness is a comprehension of environmental stimuli. It's again perception, situation, understanding what they mean for you to make future judgments. Situational awareness is crucial for making decision making. Now, if you've watched my previous videos before, my theory is that situational awareness, and then people who, for example, are great investors, they are extremely talented at joining the dots and seeing patterns in the world we live in. So for example, business people who are involved in different industries, like for example, like retail or clothing or tech, they see the same situation, they see the pattern, and then they apply that logic to each industry, and people think they're geniuses. And I always give the example of the wheel on the iPod, that Steve Jobs saw this at HP on the printers and was like, oh, that'd be really good for the iPods. It's people who are able to spot patterns across a multitude of areas and then apply it. To me, that's what situational awareness is. And then finally, reaction time is, it does what it says on the tin. Stimulus comes, how quick do you react? Some people overreact, which is a disproportionate response. And a lot of people have been talking about disproportionate response. For example, recently with that criminal case around the Deliveroo driver who was attacked by multiple people in Ringsend, by he taking out his knife, this was a disproportionate response, because a knife has a very heavy legislative protection. No, not protection, in that because it's a weapon, it's very hard to argue that brandishing a knife is a proportionate response. And indeed, it was in self-defense, but his particular trial will turn on the brandishing of the knife. And it's unfortunate, because otherwise, you know, he could have been really injured. And it's this kind of, your reaction in the moment is based on all your beliefs, your experiences, and your perception up to that moment. In that split second, that Deliveroo driver who was being attacked by multiple people knew he had a fruit knife, as he calls it, in his pocket, and took it out. And in that split second, the whole dynamic changed, and the criminal charges he's now facing changed. So I think a reaction is quite interesting. So what's the whole point of the OODA loop? And you will see in Top Gun, like they have split seconds to make decisions, like the blood is going away from their brain a lot of the time because of the altitude. The whole point is that it reduces reaction time. And ideally, you will have a blueprint plan that if something went really bad, so for example, if someone you knew died, or, you know, God forbid something happened, that you would have a plan already made how you would react. And that's really what the genesis of like winning is. Winning in any given circumstance means that you are prepared as much as possible for the worst. And that's called a negative visualization. Again, it comes from the Stoics. But you are adaptable enough to deal with the nuances in what you're being faced with. And on that note, I'm going to stop jibber jabbering. I hope that what I learned from myself today will help me in my race tomorrow, and that if I get a cramp, for example, or I don't know, I mess up in transition, that I'll be able to orient myself and react quick enough to get back on course as if I was a fighter pilot. But yeah, I really recommend the movie. It got me really pumped for my sports season ahead. I think it has a lot of lessons for life. I think it has a lot of lessons for lawyers and FE1 candidates and everybody like that, and it really fits into the philosophy of what I'm trying to do here in Law Hero. So peace out, I will see you in the next one, and thank you for watching.